Baptism is a time for family gatherings, celebration, and tradition. In the village, everything felt frozen in time. Snow blanketed the ground like an endless ocean of white, and the air was sharp enough to slice through your skin. The cold, a biting -30 degrees, didn't deter anyone from spending the night together. Inside, the warmth of the house was a refuge from the bitter frost, and the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and soft conversation filled the cozy space. The golden glow of the fireplace flickered, casting shadows on the wooden walls. I had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, needing a moment of solitude, the cold night air refreshing against the warmth of the house. The village was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels alive. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I lit my cigarette, the smoke swirling in the icy air. It was then that I saw him. A man emerged from the house next door, a few meters down the street. He was wearing nothing but a light sweater and sweatpants, entirely inappropriate for the brutal cold, and yet he walked calmly, seemingly unaffected by the frost biting at his exposed skin. His breath didn't fog in the air like mine did, and he moved with an eerie grace. "I remember you," he said, his voice casual, as if this was a normal meeting between neighbors. "You used to run around here when you were little." His words caught me off guard. I hadn't been to the village in years, and the face didn't ring a bell. He smiled faintly, nodded, and without waiting for a response, walked down the street, disappearing into the dark. Confused and slightly unsettled, I flicked my cigarette onto the snow and stomped it out. The cold suddenly felt more biting. I rushed back inside. Inside the house, the warmth immediately wrapped around me like a blanket. My relatives, gathered in the small living room, were still laughing, enjoying their drinks, unaware of the strange encounter I'd just had. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I saw a guy outside just now. Neighbor, I guess? He came out of the house next door, said he remembered me from when I was a kid." The room fell silent. My aunt, her hand frozen halfway to her lips with a glass of wine, slowly turned to me. Her eyes narrowed with confusion. "There's no one living next door," she said, her voice laced with an unease that matched the growing knot in my stomach. "Not since last year." I frowned. "No, I definitely saw him. He was wearing a sweater and sweatpants. He even said he remembered me." My uncle leaned forward, his face suddenly pale. "Who did you see?" "The guy next door," I repeated. "I don't know his name." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my aunt whispered, "That's impossible. The man who lived there, he hanged himself last year. Right around this time." A chill that had nothing to do with the frost outside washed over me. My heart began to race as I tried to make sense of what they were telling me. "But I saw him," I protested. "He talked to me." "That can't be," my uncle said, his voice grave. "He's dead." I didn't sleep much that night. The warmth of the house had turned suffocating, and the lingering taste of fear clung to the back of my throat like stale smoke. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from the wind outside, felt like something watching, waiting. The next morning, we packed up and prepared to head back to the city. No one mentioned what I had seen. It was as if the village itself had secrets that everyone silently agreed to keep. But I couldn't shake the image of the man in the sweater, the way he'd walked, his calmness in the cold, the certainty in his voice when he said he remembered me. The drive back was quiet. Snow flurries danced outside the car window, and the white landscape blurred as my mind wandered. Who had I really seen? Was it just a figment of my imagination? The village had always had its share of old stories. Ghosts, superstitions, the kind of tales people whispered but never truly believed. That evening, after we returned to the city, the phone rang. It was a distant relative from the village, her voice shaky and urgent. "A woman hanged herself in the house next door," she said, her words quick and clipped. "This morning. Just like her husband last year." My stomach dropped. I felt lightheaded, the blood rushing from my face. The man I had seen, was it him? Had his spirit come back? Or had it been something else, something darker? But the next part of her message chilled me to my core. They say she came for him. The wife. I couldn't let go of what happened. The days following the call blurred together, but I found myself constantly thinking about the man I had seen, about the woman who had died, about the house that seemed to hold death in its walls. I began to look into the family that had once lived next door to my relatives in the village. Turned out that they had lived there for over a decade, quiet people, the kind you barely notice. The man, Mikhail, had been a factory worker, and his wife, Lena, a schoolteacher. From the outside, their life had seemed ordinary, until one winter evening when Mikhail had taken his own life. No one knew why. There were no notes, no signs of depression or turmoil. It was as if one day, something had simply switched inside him, and he had chosen to end it all. His wife, Lena, had been inconsolable, and now, a year later, she had followed him. The more I learned, the more it became clear that something dark had taken hold of that house. It didn't feel like just another tragic story. There was a heaviness surrounding their deaths, an aura of something unspoken that lingered like a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mikhail's appearance to me had been a warning, though I couldn't say for sure of what. One night, I sat down with a bottle of vodka and made a decision. I had to go back to the village. I couldn't let this rest, couldn't let the feeling of dread that had followed me since that night consume me. Something was unfinished, and I had to know what it was. I called my cousin, Dmitri, who still lived in the village. He was reluctant to talk about what had happened, but eventually, he agreed to meet me and go back to the house next door. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't move forward until I understood what had happened. We drove back to the village in silence. The roads were icy, and the sky above us was a bleak, endless gray. As we pulled up to the village, a familiar unease crept over me. The house next door stood silent and dark, just as it had before. But now, it felt different, alive almost as though it was watching us. "Are you sure about this?" Dmitri asked, his voice uneasy. "No," I admitted, stepping out of the car. "But I need to know." We approached the house cautiously. The door was unlocked. Dmitri hesitated before pushing it open, the old wood creaking under the pressure. The house was cold, colder than the air outside. It smelled of dust and something sour, something rotten. The living room was sparse, the furniture old and worn. There were photographs on the walls, faded images of Mikhail and Lena, a life that now seemed so distant. As we moved through the house, the atmosphere grew heavier. I could feel it pressing down on me, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. Dmitri kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pale, his breath quick. "Let's check the bedroom," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We moved down the narrow hallway and pushed open the door to the bedroom. It was empty, save for an old wooden bed and a single chair. But there, hanging from a beam in the ceiling, was the rope. The one Mikhail had used. The room felt suffocating. The rope swung slightly in the draft that came through the cracks in the window, as though it still remembered the weight of the body that had once dangled from it. I couldn't take my eyes off it. "What are we doing here?" Dmitri whispered, his voice thick with fear. "This is madness." I didn't answer. My attention was drawn to the corner of the room, where something glimmered faintly in the shadows. I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light, and realized it was a photograph, a small, framed picture that had been left on the floor, half hidden under the bed. I picked it up, my heart racing. I held the photograph in my hands, feeling the cold seeping through the glass. It was old, the colors faded with time, but I could still make out the faces. It was a picture of Mikhail and Lena, standing outside the house in the summer. But there was something off, something wrong with the way they looked. Their smiles seemed forced, like masks stretched too tightly over their faces. And behind them, almost too faint to see, was a shadowy figure standing in the window of the house, watching them. "Do you see that?" I whispered, showing the picture to Dmitri. He squinted, then took a step back, his face draining of color. That's not right. There's no one else who lived here. It was just the two of them." "Who do you think it is?" I asked, my voice shaking. Dmitri shook his head. I don't know, and I don't want to know. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. We both jumped, our hearts pounding in unison. What was that? Dmitri whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, we heard another thud, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above us. We need to go, Dmitri said, backing toward the door. But I couldn't move. Something was keeping me rooted to the spot, an invisible force pulling me deeper into the house's dark secrets. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least, I hadn't before. But the weight of the house was undeniable. Something was here, something that had been here long before we arrived. And it didn't want us to leave. Not yet. The dragging sound continued, growing louder and closer, like a body being pulled across the floorboards above us. I forced myself to move, stepping toward the stairs that led to the second floor. Are you insane? Dmitri hissed, grabbing my arm. We need to get out of here, now. But I couldn't leave. Not until I knew what was upstairs. Against my better judgment, I pulled away from him and started climbing the stairs, the old wood groaning under my weight. Every step felt like it was dragging me closer to something I didn't want to see, but I couldn't stop. As I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and narrow, with only the faint light from the windows illuminating the dust swirling in the air. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar. The sound was coming from behind that door. Dmitri, I called softly, turning back to see him frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale. Stay here. I'll check it out. Are you out of your mind? He snapped, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here, man. Now. But I ignored him. Someone, was calling to me from the other side of that door. I pushed open the door slowly, my hand shaking as the hinges creaked. Inside was a small room, mostly empty except for a dresser and a large wardrobe pushed against the wall. And on the floor there were drag marks. The floorboards had been scratched deeply, as if something, or someone, had been dragged across the room. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the marks with my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. At the end of the drag marks there was a small door, barely noticeable. It looked like an entrance to a crawlspace, or maybe an attic. I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. There was a strange smell coming from behind the door, a mix of mildew, rot and something else. Something metallic. Dmitri, come here, I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No way, he replied, still standing at the top of the stairs, his body tense. I'm not getting involved in whatever this is. But I didn't care. I had to know what was behind that door. I pulled it open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The smell hit me like a wave, and I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Inside the crawlspace, lying on the floor, was a pile of old clothes, tangled and torn. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the bones, human bones, scattered haphazardly among the rags. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. The sight of the bones, mixed with the overwhelming stench of decay, made my stomach churn. I took a step back, stumbling over my own feet as the weight of what I had found crashed over me. Dmitri, I gasped, my voice shaky. There's something in here. He hesitated for a moment before finally stepping into the room, his face pale with dread. When he saw the bones, his eyes widened in horror. Jesus Christ, he muttered. What the hell is this? I don't know, I whispered, my heart racing. But these bones, they're not just old. They're recent. Before Dmitri could respond, we heard it again. The sound of something being dragged, but this time it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from beneath us. We both froze, our ears straining to hear. The dragging sound continued, slow and deliberate, as though something was being pulled across the floorboards beneath the house. We need to get out of here, Dmitri whispered, his voice trembling. Now. But as we turned to leave, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were trapped. Panic set in. I rushed to the door, banging on it with my fists, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something Someone was holding it shut from the other side. "Dmitri, help me!" I shouted, but he was already at the window, trying to pry it open. The old wood creaked and groaned, but it wouldn't give. "We're trapped," Dmitri muttered, his voice filled with fear. "We're not getting out." I could feel it now, the presence in the room with us. The air had grown heavy, thick with something unseen but tangible. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, even though the windows were closed. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It moved along the wall, barely more than a flicker, but it was there, watching us, waiting. "Dmitri," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see that?" He turned, his eyes widening as he saw the shadow shift along the wall. "What the hell is that?" he gasped. The shadow grew darker, more defined, and then it began to move toward us. We backed up, our eyes fixed on the shadow as it moved across the room, growing larger and darker with every passing second. It didn't have a shape, no human form, no distinct figure, but there was something menacing about it. Something that made my skin crawl and my heart pound in my chest. "We have to get out of here," Dmitri whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, but I didn't know how. The door was sealed shut and the windows wouldn't budge. We were trapped in this room with whatever this thing was. Suddenly, the shadow stopped moving. It hovered in the middle of the room, as if it were waiting for something. Then, without warning, the room went completely dark. The temperature plummeted, and I felt a cold wind sweep through the room, even though there were no open windows or doors. And then I heard it, a whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "She's coming." The whisper echoed through the room, sending chills down my spine. Dmitri and I stood frozen, too terrified to move, as the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. "Who's coming?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from right next to me. "She's coming for him, for you, for all of us." And then, through the pitch blackness, I saw her. The woman. Lena. She stood in the corner of the room, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She wore a long, white nightgown that was stained with dirt and blood, and her hair hung in tangled clumps around her shoulders. She looked at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Desperation? But as she took a step toward me, I realized with a sickening certainty that she wasn't here to help us. She was here for revenge. Lena's figure floated closer, her pale feet barely touching the ground, and the room seemed to groan under the weight of her presence. My breath hitched in my throat, and every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of the house, to escape whatever was coming. But there was nowhere to go. Lena was between us and the door, her hollow eyes fixed on me. Dmitri whispered something. Prayers, curses, I wasn't sure, but he sounded far away, like a voice fading into the distance. Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder, clearer. She came for him, and now she comes for us all. Lena stopped in front of me, her mouth opening slightly, as if she were trying to speak. But instead of words, a soft, haunting melody escaped her lips, a lullaby, quiet and sad, echoing through the room like a long-forgotten song. And then I realized, this is what Mikhail had heard before he died. This song, this eerie melody, this was what had driven him to take his life, and now it was echoing inside my head, growing louder with every second. I clutched my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The song filled my mind, drowning out everything else. Dmitri fell to the floor, his body trembling as the melody reached its peak, and I could feel the darkness closing in around us. Lena's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and her voice, soft and cold, whispered the final words I would ever hear. "Now it's your turn."